Well, it's an interesting story. So my interesting fact is that I'm an amateur kickboxer, and I never know whether to say that when I say I also work on human rights, because something feels like maybe they don't go together. But that's probably why I'm able to keep quite calm. So what I normally do is I start off and kind of tell people about my organisation, the British Institute of Human Rights, kind of what we do, also what we don't do because of the perception of human rights. But I did actually want to start with a story, and a personal story as well, because I, in May, broke my foot and my ankle and my leg in a kickboxing tournament. Convinced myself it was just a sprained ankle for 2 days and walked around on it. Wasn't a good idea. So I ended up having to have surgery, and I went into hospital, but the orthopaedic ward that I was on was primarily older people, primarily older women who were living in care situations who had fallen and slipped. And it was an eye-opening experience for me. So I've worked at BHR for 9 years, and before that I worked in safeguarding and violence against women, kind of from a policy and a practitioner perspective. So I've always used human rights in my work. It's always been kind of at the core of what I do. But I really kind of saw in practice the difference it can make, because I didn't consent to my operation until I pointed out that perhaps I should consent, and maybe the law required me to sign a consent form before the surgeon, before the team took me down. And when I got back, I ended up being kept in longer than I was told. I was given misinformation. I was told I couldn't see a certain doctor or I couldn't see the physio. But I was able to say, okay, I understand all of the constraints that you're just talking about, but I have rights and you have a duty. So I need this to happen for you to respect my rights. And all of a sudden, the doctor that I wasn't going to see until the afternoon, 9 minutes. 9 minutes he was there. But that was great for me. But for all of the women who were on my ward, it was not. So I witnessed women who were kind of degraded because they had not told the nurse that they needed to use the toilet in time and had ended up soiling themselves, and who were, yes, they had the curtain drawn around them, but actually that nurse degraded them verbally, so everyone else on the ward heard that and knew what was going on. So great that I knew my rights and I could advocate for myself, but actually what about all of the other people who were on that ward? And that's really the power of human rights. So I am going to touch on Brexit, and I am going to talk about that. Sad to say I don't have the answers, because who does? But what I can do is talk a little bit about human rights, and I'm going to talk about what they are now, because there is a bit of confusion, a little bit of misunderstanding, and sometimes a bit of a lack of confidence around rights and kind of what they are. But rights are fundamental to all of us, so kind of our presentations, I think, kind of nicely segue into each other, because human rights are rights for humans. And advocacy is about taking humans, people, and making sure that their rights are being respected. So the link is really fundamental and is really clear for me in my organisation. And what we do, we're a charity. We are a very tiny charity. You have about 1/4 to 1/5 of the organisation standing right here. But we work across the whole of the UK, and our mission is to bring human rights to life for people. So what we don't do is we don't do litigation, we don't do legal advice, we don't go into courts, but what we do is all of the stuff that hopefully supports people to get their rights respected and not have to end up in a court situation. So we produce quite a lot of resources which we co-produce with the people that we work with. I did have lots of them, but they've all gone. My table is empty, unfortunately, but they are all available for free on our website. And those come from the practice-based work that we do. So we work with advocacy organisations and the people using their services. We work with service providers and we work with regulators. So that all of the bits of the jigsaw puzzle, the people who have rights, the people who are supporting people to get their rights respected, and the services that should be respecting those rights, to really help them understand why kind of human rights matters to their practice, not just as a nice thing to do, but actually because it's the law and it needs to happen. It's not an optional extra. So that's kind of what my organisation does. So for us, human rights are about the values and the types of things we talk about every day. So things like dignity and respect and fairness, the language that we all kind of use, and it's particularly kind of our sort of standard advocacy language. But if we're not talking about human rights, we can miss that real power of the law to kind of get the best outcome that we really need to. In my workshop earlier on today, I was talking about how actually what I think is fair could be really different to what someone else thinks is fair. So being able to say there is this set of rights and there is a duty to make sure those rights are respected can really cut through a lot of those really difficult conversations. The human rights are also, in their kind of nature, they are about the relationship between those with kind of public or official power and individuals. So the rule book for how people should be treated. And that's really important because what you're talking about in terms of advocacy is kind of supporting a person, empowering them, ensuring kind of their voice is heard, but actually kind of that we go further than that and we make sure their rights are being respected and that they're being respected by those officials. Kind of just in terms of a bit of history, human rights come from a sort of post-World War II place where lots of kind of, really awful things happened and the world community came together and said, no, we need these standards. But it's important to remember that because that's why they apply to everyone equally. And it was great that we already had that. They apply to everyone equally. Whether I'm like you or I'm not like you, whether you like me or you don't like me, none of that matters. If you're a human, you have these rights. So that's kind of a really important starting point because particularly in an advocacy context, that point is so often lost when people don't feel like they're equally valued, when people don't feel like they're treated the same as everybody else. So human rights are really fundamental to that. And as I said in my workshop earlier as well, they're not a magic wand that kind of just makes everything better, but what they are is a tool that we can use to make sure that we get the best outcome for people. So some of the things that people tell us about human rights that we work with. So Kath uses mental health services not too far away from here in the northwest of England. And she talks about human rights as being basic rights to humane, dignified treatment and things I should have access to simply because I'm a human being. And Nikki, who works for a public authority in a health context, she talks about them as recognisable principles on which to base everyday work. And a committee in Parliament, which I think is yet to be reformed post-election, but we have a watching brief on it. They talk about, they look at human rights and they kind of do work around scrutinising new laws for human rights compliance. And they talk about human rights as a legal framework for service providers to abide by and to empower service users to demand that they are treated with dignity and respect. So that idea of kind of rights and duties. I'm going to be technical now, hopefully, and play a film. Let's see how it goes. Yay!
This document is one of the most important documents in your life right now. Our Human Rights Act is a check on the power that our police force, NHS, councils, and all public authorities have over us. And this law protects you, whether you are a British citizen, a visitor, a child, or an adult. At the end of the Second World War, countries from across Europe came together to create the European Convention of Human Rights. It created a set of rules for how European governments could treat us, and a court system to be used as a last resort when our human rights are not respected. This allows us, as Churchill put it, to confront all forms of tyranny, ancient or modern, with forces that are unconquerable. Then, in 1998, our Human Rights Act was passed by Parliament to ensure our 16 fundamental human rights are protected by law. So, for instance, the right to a private life means the police cannot keep DNA samples of innocent people on record. The right not to be treated inhumanely means that people in care homes cannot be abused by staff. And journalists cannot be forced to reveal their sources in accordance with their right to the freedom of expression. The Human Rights Act itself works in three main ways. First, whenever public officials make decisions, they must respect and protect our human rights. Second, when applying old laws or planning new ones, our human rights must be considered. And third, when our human rights aren't respected, any one of us can now ask a UK court or tribunal to look at our case, so we can get justice and accountability here at home. Ultimately, human rights are about power and people, and our Human Rights Act sets down the rights every person in the UK has, and the duties on those with power to make sure our human rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled.
So that's just a 2-minute, much more fun way of explaining how the Human Rights Act works than me just standing here and telling you. But I will kind of explain it in a little bit more detail in a moment. I just wanted to touch on kind of law and where it comes from and kind of what it means, because this is important to the Brexit issue and discussion. So I teach a human rights law course at a university in London, and this is about the first 4 weeks of the course on one slide. So here we go. Basically, it explains kind of where human rights law comes from. So we talk about international human rights law starting after the Second World War, and we've already heard about the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, for example. So that's a piece of law that has been discussed and developed at that international level. We've then got a regional level in the UK. So we have the European Union, but separately to that, we have something called the Council of Europe, and that's where the Convention on the European Convention on Human Rights comes from. And the reason that's important is because it's separate to the EU. It's an entirely separate institution. So one of the questions I get asked most is, are we going to have human rights after Brexit? Well, human rights in our Human Rights Act come from the European Convention on Human Rights, which is separate to the EU. So strictly no, but I will come back to that point. But that's important to understand, because it means that kind of whilst Brexit is going on, the rights in the Human Rights Act remain, and it's really important that we use them and we make best use of them. They're not kind of part and parcel of the Brexit process at the moment. Again, I will come back to that. So that's international law in a nutshell. Who needs to come to the first 4 weeks of my class in university? But as I say, I'll come back to that point because it is important. So the Human Rights Act, the three main ways I just talked about, I'll quickly touch upon them, and apologies for those in my workshop because we did talk about this as well. But it's just important, particularly points 1 and 2, because I think these are two of the points that aren't necessarily always fully understood and used, but they're the bits that can really make the difference in terms of advocacy and giving you extra power. So the legal duty on officials. So there's the legal duty to not act incompatibly with those rights. And that's really powerful because that's your hook. So that's the thing that you can go to those services and say, well, actually, there is a duty here to respect human rights. It's not a question of it's a nice thing to do, we don't have the money, we don't have the resources. It's the law. And that's a very different conversation to have than this isn't right or this isn't fair. And that duty has three kind of parts. We kind of talk about it as having these sort of three parts. One is around not breaching people's rights. The second one is around protecting those rights, and that's the positive obligation to step in and to do something when somebody's rights are at risk. Most traditionally, that's kind of called safeguarding. My background is in safeguarding. And if I had 1/10 of a penny for every time I was told we can't respect rights because we're safeguarding, my charity would have no funding problems whatsoever. But that's fundamental misunderstanding, because we safeguard people's rights. We safeguard their right to life, their right not to be harmed, their right to liberty, their right not to be discriminated against. So it's never either or. And finally, fulfill, so having the right processes and procedures in place. And because of that legal duty, human rights can be part of your language as an advocate. It can be part of how you make your case when you're advocating for a person, or kind of more appropriately with a person. So that's the legal duty bit. The foundation law bit is also important, because I just mentioned that in terms of safeguarding, often we hear it's kind of an either or. So we can't protect human rights because of this other bit of law. Well, all other laws have to be compatible with the rights in the Human Rights Act, or there's a mechanism to declare them incompatible through the court process. So they should all be interpreted in a way that is respectful of rights. So you don't have to have an either or. You have to look at how you can apply that law in a way that respects people's rights. And again, that can be a really practical way that you can advocate and you can have these discussions with service providers. And then finally, local justice. If you need to, you can go to court in the UK. So this is a test of how much you are just paying attention to the video and how sleepy we all are. How many rights were in the Human Rights Act? They were all there, and he even told you how many there were. Oh, excellent. Well done. You're all awake. That's good. So yeah, there are 16 rights in the Human Rights Act. And I know that there's a lot of discussion about human rights being kind of quite scary or quite complex, or not necessarily having confidence on them. But human rights is actually, the Human Rights Act is a very tiny piece of law. So when you compare it to something like the Equality Act that I worked on, or the Mental Capacity Act, or the Mental Health Act, it's very small. So definitely don't be scared of it. Because what it essentially does is set out those duties that I just talked about, and then sets out those 16 rights that everybody has. So these are the rights that we all have. If you managed to nab one of our booklets earlier on, they're on the back of all of our booklets, so you can see what all of the rights are. And they're the kinds of things that kind of lots of people talk about when they talk about what their rights kind of are. So about liberty, kind of not having, you know, unnecessary restraints placed on your right to liberty. The right to respect for private and family life. And that's a really crucial one. They're all equally important, but I always say to advocates, your starting point should be the right to respect for private and family life, because it just covers so much of everyday life and all of the things that you're working on and talking about. So it's choice and control. It's have you been involved in decisions about you. It's your physical and mental well-being. It's do you have access to your family. It's are you able to participate in the community. It's so many things. So that's a really good starting point for you. The other thing to say about human rights is that they work in sort of two different ways. So some rights are absolute and can never be restricted. That's really powerful if you're an advocate, because to know that actually the restriction that is happening, say on somebody's right to not be tortured or treated in an inhumane way, if that is happening to them, it's never lawful. So that really strengthens your hand in advocacy to be able to say this is just simply not lawful. The other rights which can be restricted, there's a test that needs to be followed. The main part of that test which comes up in practice is proportionality. So has the restriction been proportionate? Have all of the other options been considered by the service, and have they chosen the least restrictive option? And that then gives you the room to go back to them and say, well, what about this? What about that? Have you tried this? So it isn't, again, a confrontational discussion about you can't do this. It's we understand that something needs to happen, but can we find a more proportionate solution that respects people's rights? So again, it can be a constructive language. It doesn't necessarily have to be oppositional. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does need to be challenged because what is happening is just simply not lawful. So I'm just going to talk to you about a couple of examples from our recent work. So we've recently completed some projects with 7 service providers and 6 advocacy services and the Care Quality Commission. All separate projects, but we kind of managed to try and kind of line them up. And these come from our project with advocates. And what we did was, some of our advocacy partners are actually in the room today. I won't embarrass them by pointing them out, but I've said hello to them, so maybe they'll make themselves known. And one of them is from one of the advocacy partners. This is one of their stories, Jenny's story. And what we essentially did with those advocates was we worked together to support them to better understand human rights, and then to work out how to integrate them into the advocacy that they provide around mental health and mental capacity. And kind of what's been really interesting about that is actually it can be complex, but when you do it, and you do it practically, and you translate human rights into a way that makes sense for people in their everyday lives, you can really see good results. So one case is Jenny's case. I shouldn't say case because it's not a legal case. It's just an everyday example, an everyday advocacy example. And she wanted to leave the mental health hospital to visit a coffee shop, but staff said she couldn't because it wouldn't be in her best interest. Now, Jenny was a voluntary patient, so she could leave at any time, technically. There was no lawful kind of hold on her. She could go whenever she wanted. But by being told that it wasn't in her best interest, she was essentially being detained, but without any of the safeguards that then come up when you are detained lawfully. So she's in this kind of limbo situation. So what happened was Jenny's advocate talked to her about her right to liberty. They talked to the staff around the right to liberty, and kind of actually this could be a real potential risk. And the staff talked about kind of, oh, well, we've got concerns about safety. I was like, okay, well, we kind of understand that, but you can talk about that in the context of rights, and you can use human rights to work out what restriction needs to happen here. And actually, they came up with a solution Jenny goes and gets a cup of coffee and has actually got a bit more control over her life. A really simple example, but something that made an absolute difference to that person. Bryn's example is another one which came through one of the organisations that had been part of the community outreach learning that we did as part of the project. And Bryn was 60. And he had complex learning disabilities, which made kind of communication quite challenging. And he was in a supported housing unit, and the staff there were concerned that he might have heart problems because he wasn't laying down when he went to sleep. He could only sleep when he was sat up, and that can be an indication of heart issues. So there was a meeting about Bryn's care, which was involved kind of a range of different people there. Advocate was there, doctor was there, a few other people. And the doctor just outright said that he wasn't going to order a heart scan because Bryn had a learning disability and no quality of life.
That is disgusting.
It's not unusual. It's the kind of thing that I hear frequently in my work, and I'm sure you do as well in the advocacy that you do. But what made a difference here was that the advocate said, well, what about Bryn's right to life and his right to not be discriminated against and your duty to respect that? In that meeting, the decision changed. So it's about having a language that empowers you and enables you to speak about kind of people's rights. And the scan, it was agreed that the scan should happen. So it can be kind of really simple everyday issues, but it can also be really drastic kind of life-changing issues as well. And human rights has something to say in each of those situations and can really strengthen your hand in advocacy. So that's a little bit about human rights and kind of where we are now. What does the future hold? Big question. So coming back to this slide, in terms of Brexit, I explained that the Council of Europe, where the European Convention on Human Rights comes from, is different to the EU. So it is not part of the EU. So technically, Brexit isn't necessarily going to affect the Human Rights Act and the rights that we have in the Human Rights Act. If anything, it might make them even more important because there's a genuine concern that some rights that we do have currently from EU law will be removed through the Brexit process. So what does it mean? The million-dollar question. It's a question we're all asking all of the time. No one has any complete firm answers, but we need to be thinking about it. So from a rights perspective, as I said, the Convention and the Human Rights Act isn't strictly on the table with Brexit, but there's a but, and again, I will come back to that. But there are significant concerns around equalities and human rights protections because there are significant parts of EU law which talk about fundamental rights which are not being put into the Brexit bill, the repeal bill. So it's one area of law which has specifically been excluded. So the idea with the repeal bill is to kind of cut and paste everything from EU law, put it in the bill, and then at a later date, once Brexit has happened and we've removed from the EU, the government will then use powers from that bill to look at what we keep and what we lose, not Parliament, government. So those are some of the big questions that are going on at the moment. The fact that it's government and not Parliament that would review those questions, it's something that you might hear called the Henry VIII clause, because it goes back to this idea of kings and queens having all of this power to decide big issues. So there's a lot of work going on at the moment to say that that power shouldn't be given to government, that it should be given to Parliament. But there are concerns that specific human rights EU laws are being left out of the repeal bill, and also concerns that actually, even though some equalities protections are in the repeal bill, once that becomes law and once Brexit happens, there's nothing to stop those being taken out. And if it's the government that gets to decide that, then there's no scrutiny and no democratic accountability for that because Parliament won't be reviewing that decision properly. So real concerns actually around what that means for human rights protections.
Why isn't Parliament looking at it? Because that's where we come in.
Yeah,
isn't
absolutely,
it?
yeah.
Not once the government's elected.
Yeah.
Then we don't have any more say in it, do we?
Absolutely, and then you're right, it's then the job of Parliament to make sure that what they're doing is appropriate.
So can that not be stopped?
So that's what's happening now. So the law for what happens after Brexit is going through Parliament at the moment, and lots of organisations are lobbying MPs and lobbying House of Lords members to say you need to change this law so that the power isn't with the government, it's with Parliament. So
What about the House of Commons?
yes, with the House of Commons as well, so MPs in the House of Commons as well. So that's work that's going on at the moment. It's something called the People's Clause. So if you're interested, there is lots that you can do and you can get involved. And there's lots of organisations that are working on it. So if you Google it, any one of them will come up. And there's lots of information for kind of contacting your MP or parliamentarians to let them know your views. So actually kind of quite uncertain times about what Brexit will mean for human rights protections. So kind of big question marks about that. Before I talk about the convention, there's also kind of the practical concern as well, or the human kind of questions. So because a lot of our work at BHR is in the health and social care sector, some of the questions that we keep coming up against from people are, what does that mean for people from the EU who we are supporting and advocating? What are their rights going to be? What happens to them? So for your clients, there's a big question mark there. But also for staff, a significant amount of the health and social care sector is staffed by people from kind of the EU. So actually what then happens to those services? So there's also a really kind of human practical question at play here. But coming back to rights and what it actually means. So I said the European Convention on Human Rights, which is where the rights were first written down and then they were made into our law in the Human Rights Act. That's separate to the EU, so it has the appearance of being safe. But last December, on the 10th of December every year, it's International Human Rights Day, so it's the day that's celebrated across the world for human rights. And my organisation wrote to the Prime Minister. We had about 150 or 60 other organisations join us, and said we want to make sure that the Human Rights Act is secure. We want to make sure that it stays. It's a great thing. It helps the people that we support and we speak for and with. We really need to keep it. And the Prime Minister wrote back to us a few months later and said that although the Conservative Party manifesto in the election had promised, in the previous election had promised to get rid of the Human Rights Act, the manifesto commitment that is now in place is that we'll see what happens with Brexit. And she confirmed that whilst Brexit is going on, that repeal of the Human Rights Act for some other new type of Bill of Rights and or our membership of the European Convention will be put on hold. It will be put on hold, but it can also be taken off hold, right? And that's the real danger. So in a post-Brexit kind of situation, we may have lost some key human rights from EU law. Hopefully not, because lots of us are working on it and hope to prevent that from happening. But if that does happen, the Human Rights Act then becomes really important, because it really is like the key source of where we're finding our rights. But then that's the next thing. That's the next thing that's on the agenda for looking at. And there's a really worrying trend in the UK that we seem to be going down, which is that we don't need to be bound by international standards. We can tell other countries that they should respect and protect human rights, but we don't need to be bound by them ourselves because we can do it ourselves. Well, I should probably take you to Parliament with me. But yeah, and it's really worrying, particularly because we were the country that wrote the European Convention on Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that first document that started talking about human rights, signed in London. So it's a really worrying situation. But I am an optimist. So firstly, we will stop the removal of rights from the Brexit bill. And there's lots that you can do on a personal level if that's something that you're really interested in. But also there's lots we can do as advocates as well. And the most important thing we can do is to be really vocal about human rights and the importance of human rights. Because the people who are vocal about the negative part of the debate, they're really loud. And we need to be just as loud as they are. So we need to talk about why human rights matter and why they're important. So what you can do is improve your knowledge and your skills on confidence. Please use BHR's resources. Please kind of get them into your hands, get them out there and use them in your advocacy. Yeah.
But what about, you know, none of us, why doesn't the whole world want to say that? Because we don't know, none of us know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah.
And we could need that.
Absolutely. That's it, yeah. It's someone once said to me that human rights are a bit like a burglar alarm. So you hope that you don't ever need it because your house isn't kind of going to get broken into, but you have it there just in case. And it's really important to have them there just in case you do need them at some point. But that's why it's really important that we talk about why they're important and what they kind of do for us in our lives, in our advocacy. So increase your skills and knowledge, kind of increase your confidence. Please don't be scared of human rights. As I say, it's a tiny law. It's not anything to be scared of. It's a tiny law with a big impact. And please do use our resources to support you to do that. Use other people's resources as well. Kind of don't mind whose resources they are, but we've got lots of them that can help you. But use them in your advocacy too. Increase the visibility of it in your advocacy because that kind of helps create the evidence. Because when I go to talk to, in the kind of House of Commons or the House of Lords to MPs or to peers, it's all of the stories, that everyday advocacy stories that I talk to them about why this is important and why they need to be supporting human rights. So you can tell us your stories and we'll definitely share them. And there's lots of things you can do to speak up around human rights. So we have an alliance for organisations, for example, so you can join our Human Rights Alliance. We do kind of small social media campaigns. We'll be having one in the run-up to Human Rights Day at the end of November, start of December, so please join in with that. And kind of Human Rights Day celebrations. There's lots you can do to mark Human Rights Day, so kind of do be in touch with us. I am almost at time, so what I'm not going to do is talk you through some of the work that we've done with advocates and services, but there is kind of lots that we've produced as part of that. We have independent evaluation of our work. We're just producing a smaller report because the independent evaluations are quite huge. So we're producing a public version of that report. So keep an eye out for that because that might be helpful if you need it to lever in why kind of knowing more about human rights and using it is important in your organisations. Tips for practice, as I say, don't be afraid to use human rights. It's the law. It's a legal duty. You're on good ground with it. And use the language of risk. Services love to talk about risk. So you don't have to say that you're a lawyer and you're saying that this right has been breached, but you can say this right is being risked. What are you doing to avert that risk? Services love to do risk management. So kind of challenge them back with it around human rights. And kind of, as I've said, kind of it underpins the other law and policy, so it should never, ever be oppositional. One resource which I didn't get to bring with me today because it got delivered to the office this morning is we've just produced a short guide. So it's 8 pages, so you can really pop it in your bag, around human rights and advocacy. So a quick whistle-stop tour of what human rights are, kind of how you can use them, but most importantly, 2 flowcharts. So how you can decide whether human rights is relevant to the situation you're advocating about, and then what you can do and how you can incorporate it into your advocacy. It's online, get your copies. Everything that we do is free. We ask for postage, but everything that we provide is free. So final few things, join our e-news. We only do it once a month, we don't bombard you. You can find out all our, kind of whether we've got any training coming up, any of our resources. Follow us on Twitter. I have my phone glued to me because I'm always tweeting from BIHR, so it'll be probably me or Emily that you're talking to. We've got some training courses coming up, have a look at them, but please, please, please use the resources that we have, get them out to people. I work for a charity, I'm running it, so I'm going to make a plug for please feel free to donate to us. And there's lots of different ways you can do that. But the final thought that I ended my workshop on with earlier is something that I always end everything that I ever speak about with, because this for me encapsulates kind of so neatly exactly what human rights are all about. And also what advocacy is all about. So this is Eleanor Roosevelt, who was one of the people, and one of the very few women, involved in writing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights right after the Second World War. And she talks about human rights as beginning in small places close to home, so close and so small that they can't be seen on the maps of the world, yet they're the world of the individual person, the neighbourhood they live in, the school or college or factory, school or college they attend, the factory, farm or office where they work. And such are the places where every man, woman and child seeks equal justice, opportunity and dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. And without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. And I know that I said exactly the same thing in my workshop, but I really kind of want to just reiterate that this is what you do. The amazing work that you do as advocates is all about making sure that people's rights have meaning in those small places close to home, and that is a brilliant thing to be doing. So thank you very much.